Good morning, friends. Thanks for joining me for another of our Unfolding the Word times together. Yesterday we opened into the 6th chapter of the book of Genesis as our continuing study of chapters 3 to 11 and those foundations for the world in which we find ourselves. I'm going to look again at the verses we started looking at yesterday, verses 1 to 4 in the 6th chapter. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then God said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now you remember, as we got into this 6th chapter, we're looking at the 10th generation of humanity, the time of Noah. And we've discovered already the degenerating effects of the 10 generations as sin and rebellion against God continued to grow and become more and more of a reality. In fact, as we entered this 10th generation, as we come to the time of Noah, Noah alone stood as an individual who was in right relationship with God out of his entire generation. An amazing reality. The 6th chapter opened up by introducing us to a problem, and that problem was the problem of unequal yoking. The fact that in that period of time, during that 10 generations, and particularly near the end of those 10 generations, perhaps the last couple of them, we found that people began to intermarry. God's intention was that those who called on his name would be married to those who also called on his name. He did not want the groups mixed, those who would call on his name and those who would not call on his name. But in the final generations leading to Noah, this distinction fell by the wayside. And the tragic result was a serious outcome. It tells us here in these verses that I read to you, we looked at some of it yesterday, but in these verses we find that unequally yoked marriages produced Nephilim on the earth. That's the word used, translated in the ESV. The word Nephilim is a Hebrew word which means literally fallen ones. Now, yesterday we examined the issue of why this passage is not talking about some sort of intermarriage between fallen angels and humanity, but rather intermarriage between those who are calling on the name of the Lord, following the path of Adam and Eve, of Abel, of Enoch, and those who don't call upon the name of the Lord, following the path of Cain. The fruit of the intermarriage that was highlighted here at the end of this 10 generations is that fallen mankind increasingly intermarried with found mankind. The fallen ones became an increasing product of it. Now, what does that mean, that the Nephilim became a product of these unequally yoked relationships? Well, what that means is that unequal yoking pulled even more people away from God. There weren't many that were seeking him during these generations anyway, but particularly those who were intermarrying with those who did not share their faith and coming to God properly was causing even more people to fall away. The offspring of such relationships were characterized by Nephilim, by fallen ones. And I think that this had a very important impact on why, when it came to that 10th generation and Noah was carrying out his ministry, that he alone found favor with the sight of God. That by the very act of intermarrying, unequally yoking, that those who said that they had called upon the name of the Lord were communicating in a very graphic way to their culture around them, certainly to their children that would come out of the relationship. That God, while important, was not that important. God, while perhaps true and real, was not the most central issue of their lives and could be marginalized as a result. And that had a devastating effect, as it continues to have, by the way, brothers and sisters, in the culture in which we find ourselves. Notice how God describes the offspring, because God sees things right and properly, and he's trying to help us do the same. God saw the offspring of this unequal yoking as Nephilim, that they were actually fallen, that these people were truly lost and out of relationship with God. It's a sad terminology, a grievous terminology, one that calls for action to try to find the lost and help them to be found. But isn't it interesting as you read through this that while God saw them that way and God named them in that sort of general category, fallen humanity saw them dramatically different. In fact, fallen humanity in rebellion against God, saw them as, quote, mighty men, and later that they were, quote, men of renown. These people, these offspring, began to do many of the impressive things that were characteristic of humanity in general. They were impressive physically, they were impressive mentally, creatively, and therefore people looked up to them. People saw this as a positive outcome, and yet God, looking at it, says, wait a second, this is a sad outcome. These are fallen people. It doesn't matter what they've created. It doesn't matter how smart they've been. It doesn't matter any of these issues. They don't matter. What matters is they're not in right relationship with me, and that is not just a temporary, but will become a permanent condition if they do not turn to me. Do you see it even early on in human history? God's vantage point is so different from men's vantage point. They differ dramatically, and that's, by the way, one of the reasons why we're so fortunate to have God's Word. In mercy and grace, He gives us His vantage point, and we can see things the way they really are. That we would learn from seeing it that way. Now, the King James Version translated this Nephilim by the word giant, but I don't believe that was a very useful way to describe it. I don't think that the King James translators meant by giant exactly what people in our contemporary culture mean by that term. But Nephilim as a giant kind of misses the point. They might be a giant among people, but they are not giants before God. I think the concept literally of them being fallen is far more helpful to us to get at the heart of the process that's going on here. By the way, to get an understanding why I'm saying this and why I think the Nephilim better is translated as the fallen ones, is to recognize that later on, many generations later, during the Exodus journey, as the Israelites were drawn out of Egypt under God's care and direction, in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, we encounter the term Nephilim again. Let me read it to you. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who came from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. This was, of course, part of the report that came back to the Israelites by Joshua and Caleb and the other spies about the nature of what was the people and the nature of their conditions in the promised land as they were standing on the outskirts of it at Kadesh Barnea. Now here, think for a moment. What we learn in chapter 6 and chapter 7 and chapter 8 of the book of Genesis is that everyone was killed. Everyone came under judgment. Everyone was destroyed in the flood except for Noah and his immediate family. Everyone was killed off, which meant even if there had been some sort of inner marriage between fallen angels and humanity, the product of that would have been gone. But here in Numbers, we discover many generations later that Nephilim were still there. So we know from that the word Nephilim much better understood as fallen humanity, because there would have had to have been another sort of interconnection between angelic order and humanity to create Nephilim at the time of the Exodus journey. No, that is even more far-fetched than ever. Let's go back to the more literal idea. What we have here is fallen humanity. And the outcome of fallen humanity can be very impressive to humans, but it's not impressive to God. The use of the word Nephilim to describe these people at the time of Numbers is a very obvious use, meaning that these people were very large, they were impressive, they were big enough that it made the Israelites feel like grasshoppers, as they put it. That's not so far-fetched. Think today even. Think just in a moment about some of the pro basketball players. We got multiple people that are 7 foot and not just tall, but massive. And if you're in your normal sort of average height, you look at somebody and get near them, and they seem impressive. You seem like a grasshopper connected to them. So it's not far removed. This is realism, brothers and sisters. What came out of the intermarriage was a plague of Nephilim, of fallen people. Even among those that were naming in the name of the Lord, the cutting edge of their witness was removed by their determination to intermarry, all of which contributed to the disaster at the time of Noah. Well, next time, we'll continue in our study, move into the upcoming verses where we look at the indictment that God makes on humanity at the end of 10 generations. Join me as we do that, and I hope our studies together have been helpful to you. God bless.